So a little, Diptarka's already told you a bit about me. Yep. So I am not an archaeologist. I am a person who's worked extensively with archaeologists all the time in Australia. I am an Australian by naturalization and Indian by birth. Spent my first few years, I mean, up to my undergraduate in India and then master's and PhD onwards, and more or less all my working life in Australia. Okay, so my PhD is basically, yes, as Diptak has told you, it is about Aboriginal Australian heritage in the cities, contrary to what people are usually aware of, that Australian Aboriginal heritage, you always get images of either Uluru, that's Ayers Rock, or you get images of people standing with boomerangs or with the didgeridoo. Um, Unfortunately, that isn't all that Aboriginal people are about. They are also very, very active and very engaged um, group of people who are in different parts of Australia and different countries as such. Okay, so a thing that we usually do in Aboriginal and Australian, in the case of First Nations people, they don't mind being called Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, but First Nations is becoming the more um, accepted terminology, more welcomed terminology, sorry, I would say. So the first thing we do is basically acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Nunungwal and the Nangawari people as a traditional owners and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. The reason to do this is basically because all of the land, as you know, is Australia was originally Aboriginal Australian and Torres Strait Islander land. It isn't crown land as we know it, right? So the acknowledgement to country is basically to acknowledge that we are standing on land which isn't as such um, white people or immigrant, as I am an immigrant. It's not our land only. Okay, sorry, I'll just move on to the next slide. Okay, uh, I'll send this once you get access to this PPT. Hopefully, you might be able to see this. I'll see if I can play the trailer for you. In My Blood It Runs is a very interesting documentary. It features, I think he was at that time, he was 10 years old. His name is Jijan, and he's a little kid who was, he lives in Western Australia, somewhere, I think, maybe 2 hours out of Perth. Um, the documentary basically was about how young children, Aboriginal children, it kind of showcases um, them basically, I say, you know, not wanting to go to school, having an issue with the fact that school is always teaching you about white Australian history and not about Aboriginal history. So the statistics are quite sad. First Nation people in Australia, they account for around 33% of the prison population, amongst the highest incarceration rates in the world. And Indigenous people only make up about 3% of the nation's population, right? Um, Children as young as 10 years of age can be incarcerated in all states excepting the Australian Capital Territory, which is Canberra. So, not a very nice statistic. Okay, moving to the next slide. Okay, the map that you see on the left hand top corner is basically what Australia looks like. So, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 7, and 8, including Tassie. We've got 8 states, and we've got the Australian Capital Territory as well. That's the geographical boundaries, all very clearly identified as, as I would say, is what uh, the British kind of set it up as. Okay, this on the other side, on the other hand, the larger map, which I purposely made large, is an ATSIS map. ATSIS is the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And this was created in 1966 to showcase language and social and nation groups. So, Aboriginal Australians are not based according to tribes, as in the case of many other populations in the world, indigenous populations. They are based on language groups. So, the language you speak basically defines which group you belong to. So, these are basically, as they're saying, there are 250 indigenous languages including 800 dialects. So this is the map that represents it. Unfortunately, a lot of them have kind of died out, more or less, but these are the ones that were mapped back in 1996. Okay, next slide. Okay, here comes a part which I think all the archaeologists will like to hear. So what is popularly known is that Aboriginal Australian history in Australia as such, in the continent that is there, including Tasmania, is up to around 60,000 years old. However, recent studies indicate that, and research indicates that it's possibly 85,000 years old. And one of the leading experts for Aboriginal Australian heritage is one of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Alan Williams. And he and his other colleagues have been working on a lot of the sites that are there in Australia, and they're saying there's a possibility of 100,000 years of continuous occupation in Australia by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So this is a culture that's been living on for maybe 100,000 years, right? Making it one of the, I would say, possibly the oldest of its kind. Okay, I don't know how many of you have heard of dreaming or dream time. I'll just get to that, sorry. On the right-hand side in the image is a piece of ochre. And this is from a site in Arnhem Land. If I go back to the site, here where my cursor is, this is Arnhem Land. It is perhaps, so Arnhem Land is part of Western Australia. Western Australia is still where the population of Aboriginal Australians is perhaps the highest. So this is also one of the places where you can you see these large number of groups. This is still where a lot of the languages are still very, very relevant. So in Arnhem Land, this is from Kakadu National Park. It is one of the world heritage known for its natural heritage. So this piece of ochre was found there and is dated to 53,000 to 59,000 years ago. Sorry, it's held by the National Museum of Australia. Okay, so dreaming or dream time is two things that you will often hear about Aboriginal Australians. So dreaming is basically, it's their stories of creation. All Aboriginal Australians believe that the world was a flat piece of land, and all the features that we see on it now and as of today were created by their ancestors. So these were all powerful beings who roamed the land and basically laid out the moral and physical groundwork for human society. One of the most popular ones is the rainbow serpent, if you ever do come across, and any kind of discussions about it. Okay, next slide. Okay, I don't know how many people are aware of Australia, but Australia was established as terra nullius by dear old Captain Cook. So there are some of you who may be in the UK. Please go to Portsmouth if you can. Portsmouth is the place where they sent out the first fleet. It's not really known even to people who live in Portsmouth. It's a very sad place because what happened is 1770, basically, James Cook, he reaches the southern coast of New South Wales. And basically, the idea was to go and look at Terra Australis incognita. Basically, this was a part of the world which was known to people, but nobody had explored it. So James Cook goes there requested by the monarchy at that time, and he starts charting the eastern coast of Australia. That's basically from Brisbane all the way down to nearly the end towards Tasmania, and basically claims it as part of Great Britain on 22nd August 1770. Within 8 years, they were pretty fast. They get together the first fleet, which is 11 British ships. They arrive in Botany Bay. Sad part about these ships is that they were full of so-called convicts. You could be as young as 11 or 12 years old and be caught stealing an apple and chucked onto one of these ships. So I would say the Brits, while colonizing, were also rather merciless to their own people. So they sent them out here to these colonies to basically go and colonize those areas, make them fertile, make them, generate all the revenue they wanted, which in the case of Australia was very lucky because of its mineral wealth, I would say. Okay, so 1835, the proclamation by New South Wales Governor Richard Burke. So they basically implemented the legal principle of terra nullius, meaning that it belongs to no one. So when Cook came out in 1770 and he went along the coast, most Aboriginal people would not definitely go running around the coast and necessarily live on it because, like all older cultures, you tend to live on the ridges, you tend to develop all your habitation as such in and around ridges because that gives you the advantage of being able to have a clear view of where you are. The coast is not necessarily a place you go to till and until you need to go fishing or going from one place to another by boat. So he didn't see them. He said, "There's nobody here, so yes, we can claim it," and that's what Richard Burke does. So Terra Nullius, unfortunately, since 1788 till more recently, has basically been, it's basically been the logic, I would say, in their minds at that time, that we can occupy all of this land because it doesn't belong to anyone, so it can belong to us. And that's where the idea of the colony comes in in the case of Australia. And what you see on the left-hand side there, all these different ones, these different states of Australia were all basically colonies. And from 1788 onwards till 1901, they remained as colonies. And in 1901, Australia came together as a federation and was established as a nation in its own right. Okay, okay. So I'm now going to jump to something that might be of interest to some people. I'm not sure. So in Australian history, there are two phases. There is Aboriginal history. So most archaeologists in other parts of the world, especially in the UK, as I'm working with the Parka and the rest, there is your prehistory. You've got that includes everything from the Iron Age, all of that. Then you've got your medieval, post-medieval, and then you've got your modern history, everything. In Australia, because it is such an old civilization of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we say there's Aboriginal history and then there's post contact. Post contact is everything from 1788 onwards. So heritage also gets kind of divided that way. For instance, when you're doing archaeology in Australia, you do Aboriginal archaeology and historical archaeology. Aboriginal archaeology is everything that's predates 1788, and historical archaeology is post contact onwards. So when they dig or when they do trial trenching or anything, in the case of Aboriginal archaeology, they will go down to maybe 4 or 5 meters deep, and the pits will be at least a meter by a meter. In the case of historical archaeology, they tend to do it around 50 centimeters to 50 centimeters, and they'll go maybe 2 or 3 meters deep. They don't go further than that. So that kind of explains to you how the layering or stratification of history is as such. Okay, so I had spoken about the languages being there. So there are 250 indigenous languages were spoken on the continent in 1788, and there are 90% of them are endangered by 2019. And as spoken by one of the elders, Lindsay Church, language is part of a song line, story, spirituality, law, culture, identity, and connection. And when she says connection, she means connection to land and to each other. So, and as they say, it transfers important knowledge passed down from our ancestors and elders that guides us. So, pretty similar to India, the idea of the elders is quite significant in Aboriginal culture as such. Okay, now I will try and share my screen for something. Hopefully, it works. So, this is basically, if I may say, so here, if this was post-contact, one of the main things about post-contact was that there were a lot of massacres that happened in Australia, which are not very well known. However, this is Newcastle University in Australia. It is in the state of New South Wales. They actually undertook a mapping of the different massacres that had happened at the hands of the colonizers and the settlers. And obviously, we're talking about the massacre of Aboriginal Australian and Torres Strait Islanders. So I'll just play this for you. And as I'm playing it, you'll see how the massacres basically, the dots that come up on the map, they indicate to you what's actually happening in the country. So it's only around 1830 onwards that you'll start seeing these dots becoming more and more prominent. As you see, it's all along the east coast, and then as colonization increases, as people start moving more and more westward, it starts occurring in other parts of the country as such. So these could be massacres that are maybe 4 or 5 people killed to up to 250 people killed. So that just basically shows you the magnitude of the impact that colonization has had on populations of Aboriginal and Australians and Torres Strait Islanders. Okay, sorry. So I'll just stop that and go back to my other slide. Okay. Okay. So basically, what this shows you is the fact that, so basically, they started with the East Coast, they landed in Botany Bay, and they started occupying different parts of the country. Tasmania became very important to them because, very similar to New Zealand, it was very good for whaling. So they were able to actually come here, catch the whale. I mean, basically, yes, harpoon the whales, extract their blubber, and everything that's required from it and sell it, make candles with it, use it as a fuel source, etc. And Tasmanian, this was known as Van Diemen's Land. It was one of the places that perhaps got most impacted, as you can make out more massacres here than it seems in the rest of the country. The East Coast obviously gets dotted more because this is where a lot of the known fertile land and possibility of habitation occurred. This central part, as you know, right now, also, if you were to ever go to Australia, you'll realize it's pretty barren. Hardly anyone lives there, so they weren't really trying to get anything from there. But this becomes Western Australia and Northern Territory, as we know it, are two of the richest parts of Australia in terms of mineral wealth. The maximum number of mines actually exist in these two parts of the country. So here, obviously, these are later on, as you can say, till 1930, they were still obviously carrying on with mining and exploration as such. Mining began in Australia, I would say, around 1810 onwards. The oldest mine opening somewhere in I think that's Broken Hill in New South Wales. Um, and it's a very kind of a remote location as such. Okay. So the massacres at the moment are being memorialized. There are many which have a lot of plaques, a lot of engagement with community, because community that belonged, who had their ancestors who may have lived there, they still perhaps would be living there. Aboriginal folk might just be living there. So there is more and more an addressal of this fact that let's try and move beyond this, and move towards the idea of reconciliation. That's something that is really being put forward and is being championed by Aboriginal and Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, because their point is very simple. Yes, everyone's on this land and everybody is welcome, but let's try and admit that we've had a troubled history, and let's try and see how we can move forward with it. Okay, sorry, I'll go to the next slide. Okay. Now, the thing of perspectives of history, the historians, as we know, are perhaps quite influential in the way they write or rewrite histories. And couple of the main people, Bain Atwood and Henry Reynolds, are two people in more contemporary Australian historians who started rewriting what was known of Aboriginal history. Because before people like them came on board, they're both academics and historians. Before they came on board, everybody basically thought, yes, Aboriginal Australians used to exist. We came as white people, we took over. Some of them died out because of diseases, because of this, that, yada, yada, and that's it, right? So, but Reynolds especially really championed for it, and he's saying basically, as you can read from this, he said that early colonists, in the attempt to present the takeover of Australia, they basically tried to say it was peaceful, okay, so that they could actually push out everything that was about that included Aboriginal resistance and conflict to colonization. So the idea was to ensure that it was all really, really pleasant, it was all brotherly, it was all in collaboration with each other, which isn't true. Because the previous slide, as you saw, the massacres are an absolute demonstration that there was no such peaceful takeover of the land, as we would say. On that note, I would just like to add that you have all most probably seen some movies of Indians and cowboys, the Red Indian and the cowboys. That was the Native American Indians or the First Nations of different parts of North America, including Canada. They were largely warriors, or they do come from descendants who, I mean, their their ancestors were definitely warriors, like are also the Maori in New Zealand. Definitely, they are warrior nations as such. Aboriginal Australians, no such thing, not even Torres Strait Islanders. Very much peaceful people who basically live off the land, used to live off the land, used to be pretty happy in their own different language groups. And sometimes there was a very deeply respectful way of approaching each other in terms of a conflict or a possibility of conflict. Someone walked into someone's territory by mistake or said something that upset someone else. So they would basically be two people standing on either sides of that boundary. And or if the other person has come into the other person's, you know, language boundary, they would take spears and they would throw them. The intent was never to kill or harm. Maximum be that the spear grazes past the person. They might get a flesh wound at maximum. That's what it would be. There wasn't the aim of being warriors. These were are still relatively extremely peaceful people. Do not have, unlike the Maori and the First Nations people in America, um, they signed treaties. They knew what they were doing. They signed treaties with the colonizers, which allowed them to have land that was theirs. The Aboriginal Australian didn't know that. Neither did Torres Strait Islanders. They all basically just said, okay, whatever, you want this, here it is. And they tried to fight back, but they fought back to a great extent. But because they were all not warrior nations, they couldn't actually demonstrate that capability of fighting as such. So that didn't go to their advantage. I will speak a little more about the treaties a little later. Now, from this is what you see. The next quote is again about history. This is from a 1917 school primer. Basically, this is what they were teaching children, that when people talk about the history of Australia, they mean the history of the white people who have lived in Australia. There is good reason why we should not stretch the term to make it include the history of the dark-skinned wandering tribes, for they have nothing that can be called history. So just because you're wandering and you do not have the aspect of staying in one place, that generic idea that we know, the nomads do not have an association with history. I mean, they don't know what history is because they don't put down their roots. They don't build buildings. There is nothing grand about it. So obviously, they have no sense of history. Okay. Now, how does this relate to heritage? Tony Bennett, a very, very well-known curator, museologist, and also I think he is an he's a historian. He basically is a person who actually has done a lot of research on this aspect of how history is perceived, heritage is perceived. So he basically said that Australia was perceived as a fossilized land, right, and a paleontological penal colony. Basically, yes, it's a penal colony. So this is from the perspectives of the British sitting in UK, not the people who are there settling the country. Okay, and Aboriginal artifacts along with specimens of Australian nature were included in all their different natural history displays in European and American museum. And basically, this was also done very deliberately because then it became like this, like is written in the bottom there. It became a baseline in an epic of technological progress. So basically, to demonstrate that, look, we came onto the land in 1788, but look where we've gone so fast, and these people haven't. They apparently have been on the land for thousands of years and they haven't done anything. So that was definitely the aim of kind of depicting Aboriginal heritage as being not a contender for the term heritage as such. Having talked about this, there's another thing. I don't know if any of you are aware of it. It's a term that has been used quite a bit in post-colonial literature. That was one of the main things I was studying while I was doing my PhD. It's the idea of imperialist nostalgia. So basically, when colonizers do or did or used to, or even imperialists would land up in a certain country, they would be destroying the country. I mean, they would be destroying land in terms of its agriculture, in terms of its economy, in terms of its culture. So while destroying all of that, there was a guilt that would emerge. and they would basically say, "Oh my God, we've destroyed this. Then how do we ensure that it doesn't, you know, keep getting destroyed? So let's start talking about it. Let's start actually documenting it. Let's start kind of ensuring that at least, if nothing else, it's been well documented." Very, very much backed up by the very Darwinian idea, obviously, that these are a species as such, not a race, but species that will eventually die out. So then, how do we actually keep all that they have in museums, in different repositories, and how do we represent um, this culture that is an important part of humanity's evolution as such? Okay. Okay. Again, post-contact heritage again. So the imagery that dominated and unfortunately still tends to dominate the perspective of Aboriginal Australians is that they are unemployed, they're drunk, they're out of control, and they've lost touch with their cultural identity as such, right? So, and this was basically to say that anyone who became urbanized or came into the city, they were actually categorized as drunk, unemployed, and everything else. Whereas the other idea that was there, it was of the authentic Aboriginal person who was actually belonging to the bush. Bush, when we say bush in Australia, we mean the outback, meaning the rural areas. So anybody who lived there, they were authentic, they were pre-contact image of Aboriginal Australians. So basically, everything that's related to the bush, nature, mysticism. Here you get your typical nature culture divide that it goes on and is very, very integral to all colonization debates, definitely. That nature is where the primitive, the childlike, the the very authentic image of someone belonged, and culture is everything that's civilized. And when nature comes into culture in terms of indigenous people as such, they become these out of control people who don't know what they're doing because they're not limited to their environment as such, which is basically nature, right? So there was obviously a deliberate omissions of 19th century post-contact Aboriginal heritage here, and it was accompanied by strategies of separation and segregation. A lot of this was resulted in fringe camps on the edges of towns. Okay, and as I said, this was driven by the Darwinian idea that the native would die out. Okay, here's a very, very interesting picture. So there were different stages of how colonization was undergoing. Initially, there was the aspect of segregation policy, segregate them, keep them in nature. We live in cities; they don't live in cities. Okay. Then came assimilation, accompanied by some amount of separation. Then came the aspect of segregation again. So it kept on going back and forth all the time. This is an image which is a group of. Okay, I'll explain the context of this. So, what happened is that as and how Australia was getting colonized and getting occupied and settled, there were different people. I mean, men were, you know, going out there to set up ranches, cattle farms, farms as such, agricultural farms, mining, and they would often be alone. So they would basically get together with an Aboriginal woman, not marry her because they weren't allowed to, have children, and many times stay on, or a lot of times just walk away. So what you got was a group of half caste or half breed children, as they called them, and so basically, these kind of photographs were constantly put forward in newspapers saying these children are available to be adopted. Would you want them? And initially, when they were adopted, they were adopted as brought into families and kept as servants. And later years, if you can see, and I'm allowed to say this because I have done this research and I have enough Aboriginal friends who tell me that it's okay if I use the term, is that the child in the middle is of a fairer shade, and the others are of different shades as such. The child at the back most probably might not get adopted, but this one is who's got the X over here, and someone has said, "I like the little girl in the center of the group," right? So basically, the eye was always moving towards those who were fairer. Yes, oh, of course, this is a fairer child. We can easily adopt the child. The child can be, integrated into a family, look like us white folk. The others we can't do much with. So that was kind of a mindset that carried on for a little while. I wouldn't say a little while. They started. what we call the stolen generation in Australia. It started way back, I think, in the 1830s and carried on all the way practically till 1950s. So it is a very, very traumatic and a very sad part of Australian history. Yeah, here the stolen generation. So in what happened in 1995 is that the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission in Australia undertook a national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. This was a report that was called Bringing Them Home. This image over here that you see is with one of the, while I was working with one of the architectural, I am an architect by profession, so I was working with an architectural company which used to do a lot of work on heritage and especially a lot of work with Aboriginal communities. Roy Kennedy, a very well known Aboriginal artist, he was one of the stolen generations. So what they used to do is they used to have these. This is the mission that he lived on. This is the Kinchela boys' mission. The mothers were on one side and the children were on the other side, so they could see each other across the fence, but they were never allowed to meet as such. So, and they kept the young boys here for a little while and then moved them into another area where they didn't need, because to just ensure that they could wean them away from the mothers. And then finally, when they were grown up enough, then they would send them off to farms or wherever else they needed them to do different things. So the stolen generation is definitely one of the most gaping wounds of Australian society at the moment, to have been taken away from your family. So the idea was take the children away from their families, ensure that they forget their culture, forget their language, forget their ways, and they therefore it would become easier for them to be integrated into white society as such. But in having done that, what you do in Australia, the biggest thing is connection to land, as you would realize for most First Nations people everywhere in the world. The connection to land is integral to their culture and their identity. So they took them away from all of that. Took them away from the land, took them away from their families, took them away from culture, from stories, from dreaming, from everything. So it is definitely a very sad part of Australia, which is still people are still coming to terms with, because it's a generational trauma. It doesn't just stop at the fact that, oh, I remember being from the stolen generation. Then that same person will tell stories. One of my friends who I worked with, Rowena, her grandmother is one of the stolen generation as such also. Okay. Now the thing is, it wasn't all just a matter of, okay, they're doing this to us, so we're just going to sit there and we're not going to do anything. There were enough moments of resistance as such, always relatively peaceful resistance. There was, after that, what the map of the massacre showed was there were groups that did fight back. It's not that they didn't. But by and large, as they were coming into cities, as they were becoming more urbanized as such, a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders became more involved in the politics of colonization as such. Okay, so some of the key moments of resistance: 1938 is a day of mourning and protest conference happened. 1938, on the 26th of January 1901 is when Australia was established as a nation and it stopped being a group of colonies. So on that day, they said, okay, here we are a nation, and we are going to, carry on with ourselves as being part of the monarchy, but part of the Commonwealth, not necessarily ruled as such by a king. So in 1938, there was a bunch and a big group of Aboriginal people got together and they said, enough is enough. We are, we are going to protest about the fact that we don't feel, for us, it's not a moment of celebration. It's not a matter of rejoicing. It is a day of mourning. So it was held on the 26th of January 1938. They got together. They walked from the town hall in Sydney to a hall to another venue that's known as Australian Hall. It came to be known as Australian Hall later, and no, sorry, it was known as Australian Hall even then. And they had their small conference there where there was a bunch of them that got together, and they was basically saying that we demand equal rights, we demand to be recognized as people, and not as flora and fauna. I'll just come to that. Then in 1965, we have the Freedom Rides. This is when a group of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students from the University of Sydney decided to go through for a tour through a lot of parts of the country, to basically say that we want to showcase the plight of Aboriginal and Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, that we believe this is not the way we want our country to be. 1967 is the referendum. Interesting. This is the point at which Australian Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders stopped being considered as flora and fauna. Till 1967, they were considered as flora and fauna. They were not considered as people. They were not counted in the census. Didn't have the didn't have the right to vote. So it's only in 67 with the referendum that that starts coming into play. That yes, they are people. We have to count them as people. We do not count them as just belonging to the trees and the shrubs and the wallabies and the wombats. So okay, that's there. Definitely, a lot of Australian politics at this time. Sorry, Aboriginal Australian politics and movements were influenced by the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement, as such. So there was the formation of the Black Panthers Party in 1972, and along with it was the establishment of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, which is the title takes from there. It's about, I'll just talk about it shortly. So it was basically the point when it became a active site of resistance, which it still is. It still exists at this moment. Okay, so this is 1938 Day of Mourning. As you can see, Aborigines Conference, Day of Mourning. So they're saying, okay, we'll meet on this day, and we representing the Aborigines of Australia assembled in conference at the Australian Hall. So they basically are saying, on the anniversary of the white man's seizure of our country, hereby make protest against the callous treatment of our people by the white men during the past 150 years. And we appeal to the Australian nation of today to make new laws for the education and care of Aborigines and full citizen status and equality within the community. Started in 1938, only got it in 1967, I would say. So this is again one of those pictures which is circulated very, very widely. Okay, now is this freedom rides. This man here, a interesting man, Charlie Perkins or Charles Perkins. He was amongst the first Aboriginal Australians who actually went to university, went to the University of Sydney and studied law, became a lawyer, and he basically championed this cause of bringing forth the plight of Aboriginal people and their mistreatment over the 150 years as such. He took on from all the people who had been saying this for so many years, but obviously he was able to use the correct legal terminologies to bring this more to the forefront, right? So these were the freedom rides began in 1965. It was a 15-day bus journey through regional New South Wales, and it became, as it's known, it became a defining point of Australian activism. And here you see over here this little map of here. This is along the east coast from Sydney. They were going all the way up to Brisbane, and this is where the route was. They were basically trying to showcase uh, the cause that they were talking about, and they were trying to bring it to the forefront, right? So, and here you see, he claimed that, as Charlie said, that he claimed that in New South Wales town of Gabon, Aboriginals who go into cafes are not allowed to sit down. Pretty similar to what you had in African American. In the case of African Americans, you can't go to these bars, you can't go to these cafes. These are color bars. These are white people only. The usual, right? So what India has also obviously gone through. Okay. Uh, okay. Sorry. Ooh, that's the wrong title up there. Sorry, I apologize for that. This was the referendum. This was the little poster that went out. Right, wrong, yes. So basically, Australians voted for the change of the constitution, and the constitution still is being changed even now. That so as to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as part of the population of the Commonwealth. The good part is that the referendum was 19.77% said yes. So in this moment, and even before, even if I go back to any of these other ones, even at this point, or if I go back to this image, it wasn't that white people were all monsters. They were not. There are enough beautiful stories of how people would hide the kids when the police came to take them away. They would hide the Aboriginal kids. These were white farmers and their families. They would just hide the kids. They was like, we don't know where they are. We don't know where they've gone. Maybe they've run away. Just go away. So there were enough people protecting people. So it wasn't always bad. It was always kind of a hand in hand thing of people also. And again, in the case of the freedom rides, there were students who came together. It's a group of students from the University of Sydney, and they were white kids also. It wasn't just, Aboriginal kids. So they all came together for this cause. Okay, so then in 1972 we have the establishment of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. This is an image from 1972, and you had four Aboriginal Australian young men who left Redfern. Redfern is one of the main areas in Sydney which have always been associated with Aboriginal Australians, mainly because it was the first place where they had housing for Aboriginal people in the 1920s and 30s onwards. So basically, they drove all the way to Canberra from Sydney and they planted a beach umbrella outside the Parliament House. This is the old Parliament House. And they erected a sign that said Aboriginal Embassy. Now, there's a twist to the idea of the embassy, and it is basically to bring attention to the fact that Aboriginal people never ceded sovereignty, right? And they never engaged in a treaty process with the Crown. So they were the only cultural group that were not represented. So basically, they were saying we in our own country and on our own land have no representation. So we're going to put forward an embassy to try and demonstrate this too. So it's ironic, right? So, and it is recognized today even as a site of the longest protest for indigenous land rights, sovereignty, and self-determination in the world. This is an image from 2025. It still exists opposite the Parliament, Old Parliament House. Now, the point is that while we can talk about the fact that there was no recognition, great strides have been made even since when I finished my PhD. I finished it in 2008. So when I did my PhD, I was basically told, why are you doing this PhD? You're not Aboriginal and you're not white. So I remember telling one of my Aboriginal, she was an advisor. She was a person who I used to talk to, and she basically laughed and she pointed to my skin and she said, "That's what we have in common, apart from the histories that we have." She's saying you can talk about it. You of all people, coming from India, can definitely talk about it because as Indians, you do understand maybe not the magnitude of what happened in Australia, but definitely you would understand. So from then till now, when I did my PhD, I basically did my PhD and shut shop and sat down because there were only three other people. There was Dennis Byrne, an archaeologist who was championing this for a very long time, and Mara Nugent, a researcher at the Australian National University, and I think she's currently a professor there. They were two people who were basically the only ones who were talking about the fact that Aboriginal people have a presence in the city. They actually have history, historical associations with the city, and they have a heritage and a presence in the city. So I took my clues from there and walked into my PhD, which examined all sites of political resistance in cities as such. So I have mentioned Australian Hall. That was my primary case study. Aboriginal Tent Embassy is another. Redfern, which I mentioned, is one area which is amazing. That is again a site of resistance, a site of occupation, as such you would like to call it. So in 2015, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy I've just shown you here, it was included as part of the old Parliament House. It was included as part of its listing when they had made the big, large Parliament House. So the point is, so part of the listing as such recognizes the significance of Aboriginal rights being associated with the old Parliament House. So these, you have the different petitions that went forward, and all of these, they all were contributing towards Aboriginal sovereignty, self-determination, and most importantly, land rights legislation, which is being rewritten and it was rewritten as recently as 1993, which was the Native Title Act, which continues to be in different stages of work at the moment. So the funny part about this is at the same time as New Delhi was made, I'm speaking as an architect now, that was done in 1911. Walter Burley Griffin, I think, finishes Canberra somewhere in 1914, I think, or 1917. I forget my date. But so basically this, again, these are considered axes of power as such. So here you have the old Parliament House. It's on a hill. This one's on a bigger hill and a bigger roundabout, the new Parliament House. But this was on a hill. It was looking at the High Court of Australia, and everything was basically, you've got the King's Avenue happening here, Coronation Drive, all of that. So you had everything that was kind of showcasing this part of Canberra as being the most important part of the city, right? And these youngsters, this was 1927 is when the Duke and the Duchess of York came for the opening of Old Parliament House, 1927, right? And these youngsters in 1972 decide to go and pitch a tent there and say, we demand our rights as such. So definitely in terms of heritage, it's moved a lot. It's moved very much from the point of view of saying, let's put you into your own cabinet of curiosities and ship you off to a European or an American museum as such, or take you on fairs and have you exhibited as the primitive race that you are. Versus compared to that, definitely greater engagement. Very happy to say that in Australia now there is constant connection with country, connection with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. If you are on an Aboriginal, if you're on any site, especially for instance in the case of mining sites, and you're digging up anything, obviously you require different kinds of reports, but you also require one for Aboriginal archaeology. When you are actually on site and you know that you're identifying a site which might be requiring any level of excavation, trial trenching, anything like that, you have to have during that process and before it, you have to have someone from one of the language groups there, the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander groups. They have representatives of Aboriginal parties. They're called RAPs. So they have to be there on site with you. I remember going onto a site of a very huge, large mine, and my friend who was the Aboriginal archaeologist, I was going for built heritage. She was going for Aboriginal archaeology. We went there. There were artifacts there. We knew they were going to be there, and we had the RAP with us. And the point is, the rep would come and look at it and say, yes, I do agree, this does belong to XYZ. These are people who have experience of identifying artifacts. And they would then, we take the photograph and all the documentation with them, and then they'd sign off and say, yeah, you can take this now. And basically hand it to us, and we would take it, and then we'd have to put it in a repository and give it to the government at one point. So definitely a lot of progress has been made. It's not all bleak.